The sequence of prophecies has already begun, and the world is fulfilling every step without realizing it is reading a script written before Christ. 56 kilometers. It is the minimum width of the Estreito de Hormuz, the most strategic water corridor on Earth. On February 28, 2026, the Estados Unidos and Israel attacked Iran. On March 2nd, the Estreito closed. By March 31st, Brent crude has accumulated more than a 60% increase in a single month, the largest jump since 1988. The Programa Mundial de Alimentos has already counted the costs. 45 million more people walking toward acute hunger. No analyst predicted the exact sequence. A text nearly 2,000 years old did. The text did not predict trends, it gave the order. To understand what is happening today, you need to leave the economic analysis rooms and enter a document, not a JP Morgan report, not a projection from the Agencia Internacional de Energía. You must enter a document older than any central bank, more specific than any econometric model, and more accurate than any forecast the financial markets have produced in the last 30 days. That document is the Apocalypse de Juan, written at the end of the 1st century after Christ on the Greek island of Patmos by a man who had been exiled by the Imperio Romano for refusing to stop talking about what he had seen. What he saw is in chapter 6, and chapter 6 has a sequence. Consider the scenario that no risk model had placed in the high probability column. A maritime passage with a minimum width of 56 kilometers, through which approximately 20% of all oil and gas consumed on the planet normally flows, closes in 48 hours. It does not close completely, it closes strategically. Iran did not announce a total blockade because a total blockade would give the world a clear legal and military target. What the Guardia Revolucionaria Islamica did was more precise than that. It announced that any vessel from a nation considered hostile would be set on fire. On March 2nd, 2026, the IRGC confirmed control over the Estreito. On March 4th, it declared total control. The immediate effect was not a physical shortage of oil. It was a shortage of courage to sail. British and European insurers suspended war risk coverage. Ship owners halted their fleets. Supertankers, the largest hydrocarbon transport vessels in the world, began charging $424,000 a day for freight. Not per barrel, per day. And even so, most ships preferred not to try. From March 1st to 21st, commercial crossings through the Estreito fell by 95%. A canal that recorded 120 daily crossings under normal conditions saw as few as 7 vessels in a single day. 95% drop in commercial crossings through the Estreito de Hormuz between March 1st and 21st, 2026, the largest logistical collapse of an energy corridor in modern history. Scale the weight of this. The Estreito de Hormuz is not just an oil route. Through it pass essential hydrocarbons produced by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Arabia Saudita, and the Emiratos Árabes Unidos. A significant portion of the fertilizers that feed crops on 3 continents also passes through there. When the Estreito trembles, the whole world feels it. But the world does not feel it all at once. It feels it in sequence. First the fuel, then the transport cost, then the cost of agricultural production, then the price of bread, first the oil, then the hunger. Juan de Patmos had no access to data from the Agencia Internacional de Energía. He had no geopolitical risk analysis models. He had no satellites monitoring ships through the automatic identification system. He had a vision. And the vision described a sequence that any commodity analyst in 2026 would recognize as operationally accurate. When the Cordero opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a scale in his hand. And I heard a voice that said, "A measure of wheat for a denario, and 3 measures of barley for a denario, but do not harm the oil and the wine. Observe what the record shows. The rider does not carry a weapon, he carries a scale." In any economy of the 1st century Mediterranean, the scale was the merchant's instrument, the object that determined how much you paid for what you needed to survive. When the scale appears in the hands of the one who controls the resources, the text is describing a regime of managed scarcity. Not the total absence of food, the absence of food at prices ordinary people can afford. The wheat exists, the barley exists, the oil exists. The problem is not production, the problem is access, the problem is price. A denario was the wage for an entire day's work for a Roman laborer. Buying a measure of wheat, enough to feed one person for a day, cost exactly 1 denario. This means an average worker spent their entire daily wage just to feed themselves. No margin for family, no margin for any other expense. This is not hunger in the sense of an absence of food on the shelves. It is what specialists at the Programa Mundial de Alimentos call income hunger today. Food is available, but the price makes access impossible for those who were already committing 50 or 60% of their budget to food. The ancient text named the exact mechanism, not absolute scarcity, scarcity by price. And that is exactly what is happening now. On February 28, 2026, the Estados Unidos and Israel initiated bombings against Iranian military targets. Iran's airspace closed. At least 18 locations were hit, including Tehran, Tabriz, Shiraz, Bushehr, and Bandar Abbas. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was assassinated. In response, Iran closed the Estreito de Hormuz. Oil, which had ended 2025 trading at around $60 a barrel, began to rise. It did not stop. By March 30th, 2026, Brent was above $116 per barrel. On the same day, it touched $119.50, a rise of nearly 60% in less than 30 days. The largest monthly gain for Brent oil since May 2020, when the world was still collapsing from the pandemic. Analysts at JP Morgan warned that the conflict was crossing the borders of the Golfo Persico, extending to the Mar Vermelho and the Estreito de Bab el-Mandeb, 2 of the world's primary energy and food trade arteries operating simultaneously under threat. Follow the reasoning that the markets still haven't completely processed. The cost of maritime transport does not only affect the price of fuel, it affects the price of everything that is transported, and almost everything that feeds the world is transported. Grains, fertilizers, vegetable oils, animal protein. When the freight of a supertanker quadruples in 3 weeks, the cost of that increase is not contained within the energy market. It migrates to the food market with a delay of weeks, sometimes days. The mechanism is always the same. What moves the world is interrupted, and what feeds the world stops arriving. 45 million more people at risk of acute hunger by June 2026, according to a Programa Mundial de Alimentos alert published in March, adding to the 318 million already in that condition. In Somalia, fuel prices rose 150% in 3 weeks, $1.50 per litre in a country where 1/3 of the population was already starving before the conflict began. Sorghum rose 25%, corn 33%. More than 6.5 million Somalis, nearly 1 in every 3 inhabitants, are in acute food insecurity. 1,840,000 children under the age of 5 are at risk of acute malnutrition. The humanitarian response plan for Somalia in 2026 needed $852 million. By March, it had secured funding for only 10.9% of that. In Sudan, 80% of the wheat consumed is imported. With the blockade of the Estreito and instability in the Mar Vermelho, import costs exploded. Families that were already committing most of their income to food had to choose who eats first in the house. This is not a metaphor. It is a decision that Sudanese mothers are making now in March 2026, while diplomats debate ceasefire deadlines thousands of kilometers away. In Brazil, a country that presents itself to the world as a global agricultural powerhouse, which harvested more than 300 million tons of grain in recent cycles, the March inflation preview recorded a rise of 0.88% in food and beverages alone. Food at home rose 1.10%. For families with incomes up to 2,000 Rs per month, who were already committing 61.2% of their budget to food, every tenth of a percentage point of food inflation is not a statistic. It is the difference between having dinner and not having dinner. The text of Prophecies says described exactly this, not the absence of grain. The price that makes the grain inaccessible to those who work all day. To understand why the world reached this point, you need to understand the internal logic of each decision that built this moment. There are no simple villains in this narrative. There are human beings making decisions that made sense within the circumstances they lived in. Iran spent 40 years building its nuclear program, not out of abstract malice, out of a logic of survival that any national security analyst understands. A country under permanent sanctions, surrounded by rivals with superior weaponry, needed a deterrent. An atomic bomb is not an attack weapon for a rational state. It is a guarantee that no enemy will attempt an invasion. Iran saw the examples of Iraqi in 2003 and Libya in 2011, countries that gave up their programs for weapons of mass destruction and were overthrown. The conclusion was rational. The consequence was the escalation that produced February 28th. Israel accumulated decades of intelligence on the Iranian nuclear program. It saw reactors approaching military capabilities. It made calculations of windows of opportunity. The moment when preemptive action could still work was closing. The decision to attack was made within a logic of existential security. It was not possible to wait for the program's completion and then try to contain it. The consequence was the closure of the Estreito de Hormuz and the third major oil shock in modern history. The Estados Unidos entered the conflict with its own equation. The Iranian nuclear program represented a regional threat that unbalanced decades of security architecture in the Oriente Medio. The strategic window to act in conjunction with Israel was open. The decision was made, and it produced the blockade of a corridor through which 20% of global oil flows, the largest jump in fuel prices in 38 years, and a Programa Mundial de Alimentos alert that 45 million more people could fall into acute hunger by June. None of the three actors wanted to produce the sequence of apocalypse CIs. Each made decisions that made sense within the logic they lived. And the decisions fit into a sequence that a man in exile on the island of Patmos had described in haunting detail nearly 2,000 years earlier. The former president of Petrobras, José Sergio Gabrielli, said publicly this week, "We are living through the third major oil shock in history. The first was in 1973, the second in 1979. The third began on February 28, 2026. 47 years between the first and the third. The pattern is not random. What Gabrielli did not put in the analysis, and was not obliged to because he operates within the frame of conventional economic analysis, is that each of these shocks followed a logic that the ancient records knew well. Oil is not just a commodity, it is what the prophetic texts would call azite, the oil that moves structures, that lubricates the gears of the modern world. When the oil becomes expensive, everything that depends on it becomes expensive. And what depends on it includes the wheat you eat tomorrow morning. The Agencia Internacional de Energía spent 2025 projecting a global supply glut for 2026. Investment banks projected Brent at around $60 a barrel. Goldman Sachs saw prices falling. The EIA calculated a surplus of 3.84 million barrels per day. All models were technically correct within the variables they considered. No model had inserted the variable of a military closure of the Estreito de Hormuz. And why hadn't they included it? Because econometric models operate within a frame that excludes, by definition, any variable that cannot be quantified historically. A closure of Hormuz through direct armed conflict between the Estados Unidos and Iran was considered an extreme tail event, a probability so low that it did not enter the main simulation. But prophetic texts do not work with probability. They work with patterns. And the pattern of prophecies is not the probability of an event. It is the inevitable sequence of an ongoing historical architecture. What if the most sophisticated models in the world are measuring the wrong variables, while the script is written in a document that the modern world has archived on the religion shelf? The Programa Mundial de Alimentos published an analysis in March on what it called unprecedented double bottlenecks. Two of the world's primary trade and energy corridors are operating simultaneously under threat: the Estreito de Hormuz to the north and the Estreito de Bab el-Mandeb to the south, which connects the Mar Vermelho to the Golfo de Aden. The Houthis of Yemen, actors supported by Iran who had disrupted the Mar Vermelho throughout 2024 and 2025, returned to action after the conflict began, attacking Israel during the weekend of March 28th. Observe what the records show about this. A significant portion of the fertilizers that feed crops on 3 continents passes through the Estreito de Hormuz. Fertilizers are not abstract inputs. They are what allow naturally poor soils to produce enough harvests for populations that depend on imports. When fertilizer does not arrive, the next crop produces less. When the next crop produces less, the price of food rises in the following cycle, even if the conflict ended months before. The impact of an Hormuz blockade on global food security is not measured in weeks. It is measured in agricultural cycles, in months and years. 24 vessels attacked or involved in an incident between March 1st and 21st. 8 sailors dead, 4 missing, 10 injured. These are not commodity analysis data. These are human beings, workers operating ships on routes that 2 weeks earlier were considered routine. 8 sailors dead in incidents in the Golfo Persico, Estreito de Hormuz, and Golfo de Oman between March 1st and 21st, 2026, according to the Organización Marítima Internacional. Go back to the text. The rider of the third seal does not carry a sword. He does not carry a bow. He carries a scale. The choice of symbol is too precise to be accidental. In a first-century economy, the scale was the instrument of market control. It was the object that determined if what you brought to trade had enough value to get what you needed to survive. When the scale appears in the hands of a figure riding over the world, the text is describing a moment when access to essential goods begins to be mediated by the weight of what you have in your purse. The voice that accompanies the rider is specific about what is affected and what is not. Wheat and barley, the basic grains of the Mediterranean diet, the equivalents of the rice and beans of the Brazilian worker, are subject to rationing by price. The oil and the wine are protected. Do not harm the oil and the wine. This instruction is not benevolence. It is an observation about stratification. Oil and wine were higher value products, consumed by those with resources. What the text is describing is a crisis that hits those at the bottom, those who depend on basic grains, without completely destroying the luxury markets, exactly as happens in any severe food inflation in the modern world. In March 2026 in Brazil, the products that rose the most were precisely those that make up the daily meal for millions of low-income Brazilians: carioca beans, eggs, long-life milk, meats. The products that higher income classes consume frequently recorded smaller variations. The ancient text knew this pattern of asymmetric impact distribution before any economist had the vocabulary to describe it. Income hunger is the third seal, and the third seal is open. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo lasted 5 months and produced the first major energy shock of the 20th century. The price of a barrel quadrupled in less than 6 months. Miles-long lines at gas stations in the Estados Unidos. Rationing of home heating in Europe during the winter. Global economic growth slowed abruptly. Countries that had built decades of prosperity on cheap energy discovered in 5 months that all that prosperity was fragile, conditioned on the flow of a product coming from a politically unstable region. In 1979, the Revolução Iraniana overthrew Shah Reza Pahlavi and installed the regime of the Ayatollahs. Iran's oil production collapsed. The second shock came with it. The price per barrel doubled again. Inflation skyrocketed in industrialized economies. The American Federal Reserve raised interest rates to nearly 20% a year to contain inflationary pressure. The recession that followed was one of the most severe of the post-war era. 47 years later, the third shock arrived in the same theater, through the same geopolitical corridor, along the same maritime route that the world had decided to consider permanently stable. Each of these shocks produced a subsequent food inflation. In 1973, food prices skyrocketed globally. The FAO index reached records that would not be surpassed for 3 decades. In 1979, the combination of expensive energy with high agricultural production costs produced shortages in countries that depended on imported inputs. The pattern is not theoretical. It is documentable across 3 shocks in 3 different decades, with enormous technological variations between them, but with the same sequence: first the oil, then the wheat. The text of Apocalypse says was not just describing what would come after the 1st century, it was describing a pattern that repeats. The rider with the sword, conflict, precedes the rider with the scale, scarcity. In 1973, it was the Guerra do Yom Kippur that triggered the embargo. In 1979, it was a revolution that toppled a government. In 2026, it was a joint military operation by 2 countries against a third. The second rider always arrives before the third. The text knew the order: 3 shocks, 3 wars, 3 times the same sequence. João was exiled to Patmos during the reign of Emperor Domitiano, probably between 90 and 96 AD. It was a rocky island of 34 square kilometers in the Mare Egeo, far enough from Roma not to be an immediate threat, small enough to be a natural prison. There, without access to markets, without economic data, without geopolitical risk analysis models, he recorded what he had seen. And what he had seen included a sequence of 7 seals, each representing a category of historical event, each opening the next. The first seal, a rider on a white horse, armed with a bow, going out to conquer. The second, a rider on a red horse, with the power to take peace from the earth, making men kill one another. The third, the rider with the scale, the rationing of wheat and barley, the price that makes food inaccessible to those who work. The text does not present these seals as isolated events. It presents them as a sequence, each unfolding from the previous one, each opening space for the next. The question the text poses, and which no geopolitical analysis room is formulating now, is about what comes after the third seal. The fourth rider, in verse 8 of chapter 6, does not carry a scale. He has a name. That name in Greek is Thanatos, death. And the text is specific about the instruments: sword, hunger, pestilence, and the beasts of the earth, over a quarter of the earth. A quarter of the current human population represents 2 billion people. The text does not say this is fulfilled immediately after the third seal. It says it comes after. What the text is mapping is not religious catastrophism. It is an architecture of consequences. Conflict produces energy scarcity. Energy scarcity produces food inflation. Food inflation produces hunger. Hunger opens the conditions for sanitary collapse, for increased mortality, for the destabilization of states that were already operating at the limit. This arc is not mystical prophecy. It is what any historian would verify in the records of great civilizational collapses. The sequence always begins with the interruption of what moves the economy and ends with the impossibility of feeding vulnerable populations. If the third seal corresponds exactly to what is happening now, and the data from March 2026 make this correspondence hard to ignore, what does the fourth seal demand that the world avoid? On March 31st, 2026, Donald Trump extended the deadline for Iran to reopen the Estreito de Hormuz until April 6th. He paused attacks against Iranian energy facilities. He said negotiations were going very well. Iran rejected the American ceasefire plan and presented its own counter-proposal. The impasse remained without a concrete solution. No negotiation room at this moment is discussing apocalypse essays. No mediator is putting into the equation the fact that the sequence the world is trying to interrupt diplomatically was described in operational detail by a document nearly 2,000 years old. Not because diplomats are negligent, because the analytical frame they use to resolve crises excludes by definition any variable that does not fit into a spreadsheet, a Security Council resolution, or a model of rational economic incentives. What Apocalypse Says describes is not a conflict that is resolved by diplomatic pressure. It is an architecture, a sequence with internal logic, with cause and effect, with stages that succeed each other in an order that the text recorded with a precision that should not have been possible for a man exiled on a Greek island in the 1st century. How many seals need to open before the world realizes it is reading a script and not writing one? The third seal of Apocalypse describes economic scarcity, food rationed by price, the scale in the rider's hand, the voice that speaks of wheat and barley and oil. What the world calls food inflation and energy crisis has, in the ancient records, a technical name and a position in the sequence. What has not yet been opened is the fourth seal, and the text is very specific about what it brings. When Joan recorded this vision in Patmos at the end of the 1st century, he was not describing a one-off collapse. He was mapping an arc with stages, an arc with a direction. And each stage that is fulfilled does not end the arc, it opens the next. The Estreito de Hormuz is not the final point. It is the trigger for a sequence that the text continued to describe after verse 6. Trump has a deadline, April 6th, 2026. Negotiators have models, diplomats have resolutions. The Programa Mundial de Alimentos has a number, 45 million people. Each is measuring time with the instruments they have available. Everyone is measuring only what has already happened. Joan's text mapped out how far this goes. The oil came first, the hunger is coming. The text knew the order, and the script does not end at the third seal.